morning, everybody. Welcome. I'm so glad you could join us today here at our Faith Health Grand Rounds on September 22nd, 2021, the year of our Lord. We are so pleased today to have two wonderful internationally acclaimed speakers that are joining us today to share about some of the work that they've done across the globe, really, in terms of human sexual trafficking using positive deviance methodologies. We first met Arvind in 2015. Our speakers today are Dr. Arvind Singhal and Drs. Lucia Dura from University of Texas at El Paso. Arvind introduced us at that time to the wonder of liberating structures. Many of you at Faith Health have been part of meetings that we've used those techniques. And he helped us run a large meeting at the White House for stakeholder health at that time. And since that time, he's sort of been part of our tribe and we've been part of his. We then met Lucia in 2018 when we did a C2C tour and made a swing by El Paso and met many of her tribe and Monica. And I think Monica might have been in that room, I'm not sure. And the wonder of the work that they're doing there at UTEP in the area they call the borderland. They're on the border. And there's some wild, wonderful, mystical, almost innovative things going on there. And I hope maybe our speakers might have a chance to unpack a wee bit of that for us. But we hope someday we might be back there again. Our speakers are really acclaimed folks. Lucia is a PhD and an associate professor of rhetoric and writing studies and associate dean of the graduate school at UTEP, University of Texas at El Paso. Excuse me. So she has a very strong leadership role there. And I believe you're also an alumni of UTEP, right? Is that correct?
Yes, I got my PhD there.
Yeah, that's great. And she works on interdisciplinary projects that emphasize participatory design, asset-based thinking, and creativity. And she's also a master and a guru of using liberating structures and works with positive deviance. And I believe this work also was part of your PhD, right? Some of the human trafficking work you want to share?
My dissertation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. Arvind is also a PhD and is this, I've got to get this right, Samuel Shirley and Edna Holt Marston Endowed Professor of Communication and Director of Social Justice Initiative at UTEP. I'm tired already saying that. He is also appointed since 2010 as the William J. Clinton Distinguished Fellow at the Clinton School of Public Service in Little Rock and has contacts there with Tom Peterson, who's also faculty there. Arvind teaches and conducts research on the diffusion of innovations, the positive deviance approach, organizing for social change, and the entertainment education strategy. His outreach spans public health, education, human rights, sustainable development, civic participation, democracy and governance, and corporate citizenship. And he works all over the world with these techniques. So without any more wait time, let's jump in. I'm going to turn things over to Drs. Dura and Dr. Singhal to share with us this morning. So let's let you try to share screen there, Lucia, and we'll let you guys take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, TC.
Lucia, while you share the screen, if you can see the virtual screen behind me, it's a view of the University of Texas campus that TC just alluded to, and we do live the borderlands. So Lucia spent some time in Juarez, many years, as did Monica, who is on the call. And, so they've lived on both sides of the border. And behind the Bhutanese architectural buildings that you see, which represents the campus, I'm just sort of bowing so that you can see, lies the city of Juarez. So what you see is the city of Juarez, the fifth largest city in Mexico, and the El Paso Juarez border makes for the largest binational metropolitan area in the world, about 2.5 million people. So we have students, thousands of them, who cross the border every single day, go back. And we tend to think more in terms of, do you know whether the border's crossed you or you have crossed the border, switch hitting, changing from Spanish to English, English to Spanish. So we are delighted to welcome you. I see that Francis and Emily and Maria are on the call. They have visited this campus. Just wanted to say hello and greetings from Lucia and I. Hey, Lucia, are you going to take us forward now? I invite you.
Thank you, Arvind, for making those connections. I think those are really good connections to make about where we're situated. And today, of course, we're going to talk about positive deviance for addressing sexual exploitation and abuse specifically, but also more generally among vulnerable populations, because positive deviance can apply in various settings. Oh, here we go. It was animated. There's one more animation, the date. Okay, here we go. Arvind, would you start us off with
yes.
a story?
With a Sufi story. We are talking to chaplains and chaplain residents, and we all have our own faith. And let's begin with a Sufi story. Maybe just before telling the Sufi story, I'd say that positive deviance is a problem-solving approach. It's a very sort of practical, step-by-step process in which there's a lot of emergence. And it's a problem-solving approach which fundamentally believes that the wisdom to solve the problem already exists. And it's just that we don't have the eyes to see them because of our training, because of our view of the world. So here is Mullah Nasiruddin, who in this particular story announces right up front that he's a smuggler. And if he were at the border area where we live, he would say, climb up Franklin Mountains, the top, and say, hey, I'm a smuggler. And he issues a challenge to all customs officials and says, catch me if you can. And it's like a competition now. Mullah Nasiruddin riding a donkey with stuff loaded on the donkey with lots of donkeys behind comes to the border checkpoint. And the customs official is, okay, Nasiruddin, what do you have? And Nasiruddin says, look. And so the customs official looks, and he's pretty proficient in looking, and looks here and there and finds nothing of interest. So what does he do? Well, what can he do, Lucia? He's got to let Mullah Nasiruddin go. So, off goes Nasiruddin. Guess what? The next day, Nasiruddin is back. He's again riding a donkey, stuff loaded, lots of donkeys behind, even more stuff loaded. And today the customs official is, what do you have, Nasiruddin? And Mullah Nasiruddin says, look. And so the customs official this time really looks here and there and, behind the ears of the donkey and under the hooves, and finds nothing of interest. So, well, what does he do? What can he do? What can he do, Lucia? He's got to let
him go.
Off goes Nasiruddin, and you know what happens the next day, right? Nasiruddin is back riding a donkey, stuff loaded this time. More donkeys behind, more stuff loaded. And the customs official, of course, has consulted his manual. He refers back to his notes that he took when he was attending the PhD program at the University of Texas, El Paso in customs checking. Make sure he, is on top of his work. And he says, Nasiruddin, what do you have? And Nasiruddin again says, look. And this time he really looks. Now here and there and over and under and, behind the ears and under the hooves, and puts on his X-ray glasses and administers the sniffing test. And, well, guess what? Finds nothing of interest. So what does he do, Lucia?
He says, pásele.
Carry on, Nasiruddin. And this happens, as you've probably figured out, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. Meanwhile, he gets a postdoc at Wake Forest in customs checking. And, year after year, decade after decade, and of course, is unable to catch the mullah in an act of wrongdoing. And so the customs official, there comes a time when he finally announces his retirement from customs checking, and Nasiruddin, he's no fool. He, the very next hour, calls a press conference and says that he's retiring from smuggling. Well, they happen to meet in Winston-Salem in a Starbucks, and the customs official offers to buy Nasiruddin a macchiato and says, Nasiruddin, now that I'm an old man, Nasiruddin, now that I am in no official capacity to do anything to you, please, please, for the sake of the Lord, for all the sleepless nights that I've spent, what is it that you were smuggling? Donkeys, says Nasiruddin. All right. So the question is, why was the customs official unable to see the burros, the donkeys? I mean, they're not small. They don't hide in your pocket. The answer to the problem that he was trying to solve was right there in front of him day after day, not one donkey, many donkeys, but he was unable to see them. So now people study this, and some would characterize this. If you are Herb Simon, you'll talk about bounded rationality. If you're Kenneth Burke, he would talk about trained incapacity. And depending on whom you speak to, you may hear the explanation of this phenomena, we becoming blind to what exists in front, as occupational psychosis. Yeah. Simply put, if you're a hammer, you begin to look at the world as a nail. So the fundamental premise, I'm going back, of positive deviance is that the answers that you're looking for, the solutions that you wish to find, are like Nasiruddin's donkeys. They're right there in front of you. It's just that we do not have the eyes to see them. Lucia, move on.
I'm coming. I had, of course, a first grade visitor coming in to say goodbye, even though I had already said goodbye. Let's see, here we go.
So we've already said this, or let's just say it one more time. The wisdom is already there. Maybe this graphic, this picture gives you an idea of what positive deviance is. We'll tell you some stories so that this would become clear, but the fundamental premise is the solutions are there. And in every community, positive deviance approach would say there exist ordinary people who have found extraordinary solutions to existing problems against all odds, but we don't see them. And we don't see them because we are not trained to see them, okay? Oh, Lucia, am I telling this story or are you telling this story?
Yeah, you sent me the slide, but
okay,
it's up to you.
Go ahead. All right. When Lucia invites you, never say no. You also see how well coordinated we are. So a little bit of history is useful, a little bit of setting the container. So let's ground what we've heard about Mullah Nasiruddin and the definition of positive deviance with an actual case. I see that Lucia and I are authors of this case with Jerry Sternin. Jerry Sternin and his wife Monique sort of founded, I would say, the positive deviance approach, and it happened in the rice fields of Vietnam. They were there to solve a problem. The problem was malnutrition. 65% of the kids under the age of 5 in Vietnam in the year 1990 were malnourished. Jerry and Monique were called in, and they began, through a strange set of circumstances, to ask a question that had never been asked before to unearth positive deviance. And the question simply was, Lucia, is there a slide after this?
Yes.
very simply, the question was, are there children under the age of 5? So they're working initially in 4 rural communities. Are there children under the age of 5 from poor rural households that are well nourished? This is a question that we never ask. In fact, if you do regression work, this is not a hypothetical deductive question you would ask. You would basically say, children under the age of 5 from poor rural households will be malnourished. And you'll confirm it, and at p less than equal to whatever, 0.05 or 0.01, you'll get published, and maybe it's a good piece of work. Jerry and Monique asked the question, are there children under the age of 5 from poor rural households that are malnourished? And Lucia, the answer was?
Yes.
Some. Very few. In fact, out of the 3,000 kids in these 4 communities, there were a handful, actually a few dozen, who fit this criteria. Voila. So the answer to the problem is there. Yeah, the donkeys are there. It's just that we didn't have the eyes to see them until we asked this question and then backed it up by data. Okay, so now you've got a couple of dozen families who basically have the wisdom to solve the problem. And so they go looking. And Lucia, what do they find? What are they doing, these families, that others are not doing, which explains their well-nourished status?
Oh, I thought you had it on the next slide, but oh yes, you did. Okay.
Okay, so.
So instead of just using the sweet potato, the root part of the sweet potato, they add greens to their meals. They also forage for tiny shrimps and crabs in the rice paddies that are normally discarded. It's not something that people typically eat, but they grind those up and use the shells for calcium and other minerals and nutrients. And rather than feeding their children 2 or 3 times a day, they feed them several times a day with smaller, more frequent meals. And it was common practice to carry a child on your back and feed them while they were on your back. But instead of doing that, they look them in the eye, take them off of their back, look them in the eye and feed them actively. So these are small things, but they made a big difference in the nutrition of the children.
Right. So basically, these are the mini donkeys, no? And these are the many donkeys. Uncommon practices, they were there. And then you ask these mothers, how long have you been adding greens? Oh, my mother did that. And so, well, the donkeys have been coming and going for decades. How long have you been taking these teeny tiny shrimps and crabs from the rice field? Because the crabs, the shellfish, the shrimps and the rice fields were considered to be duck food, or chicken food, not fit for human consumption. So, so the wisdom to solve the problem as also the resources to solve the problem were there. And that is because you asked a question which, if you live in a probabilistic world, it's a non-probable a question to ask. It's an impossible question, actually, no? Impossible, implausible, improbable, that somebody who's poor doesn't have access to resources to solve the problem. The answer is they have, and now you figure out what's it that they're doing that others are not doing. And once you figure that out, then you create the conditions for others to practice these behaviors. Okay, moving on, Lucia.
All right. There we go.
All right.
So today, Arvind told you the cornerstone case, the Vietnam story, well, not story, but case. And we're going to talk about 3 more positive deviance cases in the area of child protection, exploitation, trafficking. And what you see on your screen right now is a picture of Arvind and I working with a team from Save the Children in the district of Pader in northern Uganda. And there, were we in Gulu, Arvind?
Yeah.
The town of Gulu.
Yeah.
So we went to several villages, Lukole and Oh.
Kedoyo?
Oh, no, that was in
Indonesia?
Indonesia.
It doesn't matter, yeah.
But we went to both Uganda and Indonesia. This just happens to, this slide represents Uganda a bit more. And we're going to tell you a little bit about those cases. So the first one, it hits trafficking directly, and was in Indonesia, in East Java. And here again, we're looking at a problem. An estimated 30 to 40% of all commercial sex workers in Indonesia were under the age of 18 years of age, suggesting a high incidence of girls trafficking. It was tempting for a girl to go into this industry because she could make more in one night than her father could make the whole year, especially if she was a virgin. Or it was tempting for families to send the children off because of desperation to make money. And obviously in the United States, we have different circumstances, but I think I've noticed, at least in some of the work that I've done with foster youth and trafficking, that the temptations, even though they're of greater magnitude, they're similar in nature. So rather than delving into as Arvin noted, the problem of trafficking from that end, we're looking at the solution by asking a PD question. Are there any poor families, very poor families, that manage to avert trafficking despite financial temptation? Do they exist? And if they do, let's find them, go through a mapping process. So literally find them and plot them on a map as green dots as opposed to red dots, and see what they are doing to avert trafficking. The other difference that I would like to point out is that we're not looking at root causes, and that's something that we're very tempted to do in research, and not only in research, but I think in organizational change, is we're looking at why this is happening. And it's not that we're not interested in that, but we're really looking at what is being done on a daily basis to avert the behavior, the undesirable behavior. So in Indonesia, they had a map where they put the villages, the physical, geographical elements, rivers, mountains, etc. And they plotted where the children who were staying in the villages lived. And then they interviewed in a community gathering fashion these families to see what they were doing. So here you can see one of the things we did in line with the positive deviance methodology as evaluators was to utilize participatory sketching to ask our research questions. So instead of just doing traditional interviews, we asked people to draw before and after pictures. So before positive deviance came into your village, after positive deviance came into your village. And you can see the before sketch on the left in the village of Gadung Sari, sex traffickers strategically lent money to poor parents and then lured their daughters for work in the entertainment industry. After positive deviance, the village implemented ID cards. And so in order to leave the village, you had to show your ID card. So they worked with local government officials, regional and local government officials, to educate the community about how to work legally, and they utilized these ID cards. So the traffickers became frustrated and left. Of course, they went somewhere else, but in this case, Gadung Sari maintained their behaviors. I think when we went there, they had sustained the project for 5 years. And some of the alternatives, some of the things that they did to replace trafficking were to provide formal and informal schooling opportunities where girls could learn, of course, formally in school, regular subjects, but we're also looking at sewing, beauty salon courses, flower growing, and then for boys, motorcycle repair. They also became entrepreneurial and would sell, cassava is a common root. So instead of potato chips, cassava chips. And so they would grow them, harvest them, dry them, package them. And the girls in the families had access to these entrepreneurial activities. So, and they were able to have an alternative source of income. Another sign of change in Quedoyo that the participants noted, and Quedoyo is a different village from Garimsari, is they had a lot more gatherings, whether it was at the mosques, and this I think applies to this group, the faith-based initiatives, citizen forums, interactions with community members, with government officials. So there was a lot of coordination amongst government, faith-based organizations and the neighborhoods, the communities. Anything you want to add or transition into?
Yes, so Lucy, if you go back to the previous slide, let's see what's the equivalent here of what happened in Vietnam. The uncommon practice, the donkey was mothers who added sweet potato greens. So one of the things, for instance, Lucia and I discovered when we were back in these villages is the common practice may have been just to sell cassava, or just to sell bananas, or just to sell ginger. And that's okay. What's wrong with that? Whereas in these families, what they would do is they would take cassava, turn that into chips, take ginger, turn them into ginger chips. And you can imagine if you sell one banana, how much you're going to get. But if you sell banana chips or you sell banana cakes, so there were lots of little things that they were doing which was accessible to all, which created the conditions for them to not leave the village. Okay, moving on.
All right.
Okay, so I'll just go through this very quickly. Notice that in the case of Indonesia sex trafficking, we are looking at issues of prevention. And it's useful if you're an interventionist to look at not just prevention, but also look at mitigation, harm mitigation or harm reduction. And you also look at rehabilitation, for those who have been through. So this case also comes from Indonesia. We've got a sort of an Indonesia theme, but we'll also take you to Uganda. And the question simply here was directed at commercial sex workers. The problem was high rates of HIV, rise in HIV rates among commercial sex workers. And the question was simply asked, are there commercial sex workers who have been in the trade for 5 years, which means, it's sort of like the equivalent of being poor or being landless, who have a lot of clients, which means they are at the highest of high risks, but who have somehow found a way, because that's the norm, that's not the norm, to successfully negotiate condom use and to remain HIV free when most others are not in a position to do so. Now, again, this is not the kind of question one asks, like, are the solutions already here? So in a study that was done by Jerry Sternen and others in brothels in Eastern Java, Indonesia, this question was asked, and the answer was, well, yeah, out of 400 commercial sex workers who operate in these brothels, there are only about 50% who've been tested. Okay, so who test themselves. And of these 50%, well, there's very high rates, 25 to 30%. So you basically use a sieve and you find a few who fit this criteria. So the question is, how are you able every time to negotiate successful condom use? And the answers surprised us, and they should, because you're asking a question that is improbable and implausible. You talk to commercial sex workers, like talking to mothers. Now, how come your child is well nourished? Or how come your daughter is not, in the sex trade? So how come you can negotiate condom use? And they realized that it was, again, a series of micro behaviors. When the client walks in, they don't pull out a condom and say, hey, want to negotiate condom use? No. Their strategy was very different. It's all about timing. In their own words, what they were saying is when the client walks in, we know why they're there. They're there to have fun. So guess what? We work on our clients. And, we do a sort of a little tease. And, we strip our clothes. And, we play with them. We rub them here. And when they get to a point of no return, these are their words, not mine, that is when we pull out. And then we, and at that time, it's like, let's get on with it. And they had many other beautiful strategies. For instance, they would say, you look like a man of gold, So like in Pretty Woman, Julia Roberts, and she pulls out a condom and says, well, here's one which is just right for you, because as we turn off the light, I'll see you glow in the darkness. So she has a neon condom. So basically they have strategies whereby which they play to the spirit of adventure. And what they're looking for is not time out. They're looking for healthy passions. There were certain other things that came out too, uncommon behaviors. What if somebody, still doesn't agree to use a condom? He said, well, then we pull out, this last arrow from our quiver. Well, and what's that? We say, listen, I'm a commercial sex worker. I work with many clients. You are a happily married man. You come to have fun with me. You need to wear this. This is not for me to protect me. This is for you to protect This is for you so you can protect your reputation. And this was the key for them to frame it, not in terms of use this to protect you physically, or use this to protect you from, the virus not coming through. The positive deviant behavior, the uncommon practice was to say, use this to protect your reputation. And that's what made all the difference, because here's a happily married man, with children, who's coming to have fun, and reputation counts. Behind closed doors, under the sheets, anything can happen. But if your reputation gets out, that's not acceptable. So anyway, so again, once you figure these little donkeys out, these little uncommon practices by those who are in harm's way and who can mitigate harm, perhaps they can be scaled. Over to you, Lucia. Case 3.
Case 3. So case 3 is reintegration of child soldiers in Uganda. And they were trafficked initially because the Lord's Resistance Army captured children for more than 2 decades. And when children were captured, they were tortured, but they also were taken back to their villages to torture their own families, their own neighbors, to kill neighbors. So once they were able to escape, they had already been used as porters, sex slaves, and they were not trusted by the communities, because returning to a community where you had done violence is obviously unthought of, right? So this conflict enslaved over 50,000 children, and they committed a lot of human rights violations. So the question here, the problem is formerly abducted child soldiers are not successfully integrating into their communities. So the positive deviance question was, are there any girls who have reintegrated successfully with children, for example, if they had come bearing the enemy's child and they were unwanted, were any of them able to reintegrate, and without access to special resources, right? Not being taken in by an uncle or by a family member who was compassionate, but who had to fend for themselves. And oftentimes they had to go into other communities that were not their communities of origin. So similarly to Indonesia, the community mapped their village and outside of their village, and mapped where these girls existed if they did, right? And then they conducted interviews in a similar way again to see what they were doing. So let me forward here. So some of the uncommon behaviors were similar to Indonesia. They were collaborative. There was a lot of communication going on. And instead of working by themselves in the field, you could see that one of the drawings has a girl in a purple dress and a girl in a pink dress on the right, top right corner. Instead of farming by myself, I farm with somebody else. And this increases how quickly we do things, but it also allows one of the girls to go back and take care of her child when she needs it, or to go to school. So they're able to take turns when they have a plot of land together. This goes against, well, most of us would want to have our own plot of land, right? So that we own everything that comes out of it. But in this case, that collaboration and sharing enabled them to do more things. They also worked together to sell things. So they started businesses together, and they practiced things that were not common, like mixing all of their seeds. So this is Helen on the right side of the screen. She says, I mixed all of my seeds, sunflower, cucumber, and others in one basket and spread them in the field. These plants grow well together. I learned this skill from my father. He was a good farmer. He taught me about intercropping. So this is a PD practice. Normally you see the same type of crop in each field, but she takes this wisdom from her father and implements it. And then it can be replicated amongst other girls to the point that they became successful enough. At the bottom, you see the girls gathering their crops on the bottom left. And then at the very, very bottom, you see a donkey tied to a tree. They're able to purchase or to accumulate acumen, right? With their savings. So they were saving and they were able to accumulate acumen. And this kept them safe for a while. Now, in addition to looking at the behaviors of the girls, one of the things that stood out is that the girls who were successful had an auntie or an abayo. And this picture here on the left-hand side, all the way to the left, you see an auntie. And this is a woman who takes the girls in and offers them kind of a bridge to the community. So she vets them to the community. She allows the community to accept them in a way. So when you're looking at PD, you're looking at the uncommon behavior, maybe of a target population, but then you could also start looking at other enabling factors. Sometimes they are people in the community. Other times it's an institutional resource or an organizational resource that is providing a gateway to solutions. So you might see other patterns. You might have noticed other patterns as we've gone through the cases. And then I just want to point out the posture of the girl in the middle, putting her elbow on Arvin's shoulder. I think that captures just the confidence of full reintegration, right? She's just poised right there on a man's shoulder who she doesn't know, who came from the outside, and who she says, let me show you my stuff, right? Let me show you what I've done. So there's a certain sense of pride that we noticed in these girls. And I think that again is probably a sustainable pattern. So I'm gonna move here to our more interactive portion. Although Arvin, we have about 15 minutes. So
yeah, let me just make a few linkages, and then maybe TC and Gary can provide us guidance on how to proceed. Okay. But we'll stop in a minute. This picture was taken, well, I clearly have a lot more hair, in 2008, so 13 years. And I distinctly remember she insisted that she take a picture with me. she insisted that her abayo stood next to her, the aunt. And, you know, so here we are getting ready to take a picture. And then she puts her arm over me. And you can see her expression. No. So the reason why, one of the things which we need to connect in Uganda is normative practice for these returned abductees, returned girls, was to sell their body. Their body was what they had to work with. And that's the way most of them survived. So reintegration was important so that it wasn't just, well, you know, here's a body. But how do they find the courage? What are the little things that they do, whether it's mixing of seeds, whether it is, you know, when you go pick up water, these girls, instead of one jerry can of water that they would carry two. And, you know, now you can sell one jerry can of water to a construction site. When they went to pick up firewood, they picked up 1.5 loads as opposed to, you know, just an ordinary load. So there were these little micro practices which saved them from selling their body. Yeah, and so they were rehabilitated. Now, the other thing I'd say is we've applied positive deviance work to a whole host of other problems. And here's a chaplain story. We were in Billings, Montana, Gary and TC and I doing work. This is, again, 15 years ago. We're trying to look at hospital-acquired infections and how, you know, were there folks who were doing things which others were not doing. And guess what? At Billings Clinic in Montana, we found a chaplain who, well, normative practice, you know, perhaps they've got their Bible and, you know, if people want them on their hearts, you know, they place the Bible. And of course, then you're saying, is it, you know, a little more than transferring? If you're interested in infection transfer, you know, you're spreading the word of God, but are you also spreading something else? We found one chaplain whose Bible was in a plastic cover and used to put sanitizing wipes in his pocket. And before handing it to a patient or putting it on their chest, they would pull it out and they would, you know, sanitize it because there was a plastic cover and do so. Now, this wasn't normative practice. But if you figured that out, you know, we found doctors who kept sanitizing wipes. We found doctors who, you know, didn't wear their white coats, who wore half sleeve, who didn't wear ties. Because again, these are all vectors of infection transfer. So once you figure these things out, the little things that are already happening, then you can find a way to scale them. So anyway, so it's positive deviance is one approach. The wisdom is there. It's with everybody. It's with the aunt, it's with the chaplain, it's not just with the doctors. And can you find ways to bring out that wisdom for prevention, mitigation, for rehabilitation. So TC and Gary, we'll leave it up to you. We can try to do a breakout room, or, you know, if there are any questions, we can request them. Or if you wish to do Q&A in another way, we are open to it.
Arvin and Lucia, that's wonderful. And this is great work. And I've heard some of this, but I always hear something new every time you present. I think because of the time constraints and because we would like to harvest the wisdom of you two, maybe let's open things up for just generic questions in a single session. I think we don't, there's always a little loss of time whenever we do breakouts. So, and I can see the whole screen now. So does anybody have a question? You want to raise your hand or jump in? I've got some things I'd like to ask too, but let me allow other people to come into that space since we have these brilliant positive deviance practitioners in our midst this morning. Gary's got a question while y'all warm up.
So in many environments, whether it's a village or a hospital or a community, the religious leaders are often thought of part of the team that reinforces the norms, the normal behavior. And the essence of positive deviance is to look for abnormal behavior, find the behavior, and then promote that. So it actually asks sort of those of us who are in the religious biz to sort of kind of flip our credibility so that it's in service of the abnormal. That's really the example in Billings, but is that what you're saying? I like that. I like abnormal, but I'm not a very normal
It's deviance after
person.
all.
Yeah. It's a practice variation. So that's one way. There's variation of practice everywhere. And oftentimes, I think, Gary, what you're saying, what is normalized is evidence-based practice. And, what's wrong with that? That's fine. We should, but positive deviance is practice-based evidence. Somebody who is engaging in a variation of behavior, which you can call abnormal or non-normative. And the behavior itself, that little donkey or that big donkey, which exists because that practice variation exists. Somebody has got their Bible in some mothers are. And so, yes, it makes us more mindful of looking at things that are happening around us. And infection control is not just the business of the chief infectious disease officer. It is, the housekeeping staff who takes a mop and goes from one room to the other. They're doing a little more than, you can. So if you dip your mop in a bucket of chlorine, you're and many housekeeping staff may not do that, right? That, okay, well, you keep just sort of, you just go from one room to the other. But the key is that every time you use, it's the same as pulling out a sanitizing wipe and, prior to each and every contact with the Bible. So if one develops the eyes or the wisdom to say that the wisdom is here, it's lurking all around, you begin to see things which otherwise we don't see them. No?
And I would just add really quickly to that sometimes when I've done this, people say, well, does that mean I have to do something that's against the rules or that's illegal? And I think it's not that. It's when you're told, prevent infection by washing your hands, it's the way you wash your hands, or it's the way that you keep your utensils in a Ziploc bag or whatever it is. It's in the context of masks and infection prevention right now with COVID, it's at our university, it's telling people, disclosing what your family situation is. It's a small behavior, but it doesn't say on the signs, disclose what your family situation is to your students so that they might be encouraged to wear a mask. It says, masks are encouraged. So it's the way that you approach it. That's the small difference. It's a little hack in a way, or a workaround.
And those subtle differences make a huge difference, don't they, really, in the end, in terms of outcomes. Francis has got a question. In the Ugandan example, was there a pattern among the aunties who served as bridge keepers for the young women who were returning to their villages from captivity as child soldiers?
Yeah, good question, Francis. In Acholi culture of northern Uganda, abayos, aunties do play a key role. They're sort of mentors. However, when we talk of patterns, Francis, now the interesting thing about the positive deviance approach is you don't need to look for a pattern. This behavior doesn't have to be common to a lot of people. By definition, if there is one behavior that is being practiced, which is not the norm, it is a deviant behavior and it may hold the key. So the aunties were absolutely critical because they were part of the Acholi culture, but not everyone was using aunties. Not everybody had aunties. And we did see that, again, it's the enabling community that Lucia is talking about, that, we all operate in a web of relationships. Our work in schools, for instance, has very clearly shown that those students who face all the odds, but who are successful, who can graduate on time or who don't drop out, they almost always have mentors. They almost always have somebody who's got their back. So the aunties, I think in that sense, represent the pattern of affirmation, validation. I see you, I hear you, you matter, girl. And that makes a difference. I see a question from Tom: were the successful people resistant to sharing their positive practices? Excellent question, Tom. In positive deviance, one of the lessons we've learned is you never make a hero out of the ones who are practicing these behaviors. What you make a hero out of is the behavior that's making the difference. So you don't parade, look at this chaplain who uses this, plastic cover and has no. What you're doing is you're saying, think of ways in which you can break the cycle of infection because you're exchanging stuff. Focus on that practice variation. So the hero is not the positive deviant. They are not the ones who are. The hero is the behavior that's making the difference. It's not the mother who's feeding, their child greens. It's the feeding of the greens which needs to be replicated. Because there is a lot of resistance when you put people on a pedestal. And people say, oh yeah, well, that person is different. Mm-hmm. So you're focusing again, I'll keep repeating this, practice variation. It's practice-based evidence, yeah.
So the way you frame the questions and the way you conduct the interviews is important in that sense, because often people don't know that they're positive deviants. Yeah. They're just doing what they do. And so when they've shared, at least in my experience, when they've shared this information, it's just been like, well, what I do is I just make sure I always have my pen in a plastic bag. And then when I go into a patient's room, I take it out and then I disinfect it and I put it back in the bag. That's what I do. And so oftentimes it's just, I don't know that I'm doing anything special. So that's another interesting point.
Some of the work that we were doing, and Lucia, you and I were in Little Rock, Arkansas. I think Tom is there. And there are lots of hotspots, right, for sex trafficking in the US. And often when there are two major, highways that intersect. So I can't remember, I think it's 40, Interstate 40, and then something else. And, they're big truck stops and so on and so forth. So schools in that area, young girls were especially vulnerable. And one of the stories I remember, Lucia, that we heard when we were working with Children's Hospital in Little Rock, with those who were working with sex trafficking, they said that some of the teachers were very important. It's not about the girls and how do you prevent them, but it's the teachers who see certain patterns in certain girls because they see them or don't see them on a regular basis. And they are the ones who then, may work with the family or may work with the counselor in order to prevent or in order to reduce harm or to rehabilitate. So again, the target audience, prevent people from engaging in sexual trafficking, however you define it, is not the only way to go. Your line of vision has to look at that enabling community, the abayos, the teachers, the counselors, and the chaplains in the case of infection control.
Wow. I have a quick question, and there's not much time left, but I am curious, as a person who, obviously you went to Indonesia, you went to Africa, as an outside change agent, evaluator coming in with this methodology, how do you build trust to get these beautiful stories? And just, and that's probably a whole hour, but I'm just curious, any quick thoughts about that?
Lucia, you want to, I may have a quick thought, but do you want to go first?
Well, I have to tell you that this was my second research trip ever. And so I learned a lot from Arvind and how he approached people. And oftentimes my first instinct would have been to jump into, say, a data collection or a question and I think spending some time having conversations, asking people about themselves, who they are, et cetera. I mean, we have to build trust rather quickly. But I think the spirit of liberating structures and PD enables that by focusing on the human that you're working with. And so one of the things specifically is that we worked with Save the Children staff, and we spent quite a bit of time in the car with them. And something I noticed was that time was not time wasted. I mean, Arvind was asking Baska in Uganda, right, about her work, her family, herself. And then we learned a lot about the communities from that. So we used her as kind of also a bridge into creating trust. If she trusted us, then she could talk to the community members and say, this, it's okay. And then, of course, the methodologies. But Arvind might have been too much.
No, I'll just say that in PD, you go fast by going slow. And I think what Lucia is referring to is that the slow part is the building of relationships, deep personal relationships. And those who work with the faith community, and you're represented here, you know about the value of that. And you go fast by going slow because the tailwinds or that boost comes from the trust. And trust is, as we were saying, latent energy that is stored, right? It's not a wall of resistance that you're trying to overcome. It's something that, allows for all the tides, to come in and then for all the boats to rise. And maybe that elbow on my shoulder is representative of that trust. That's a far better indicator than any scale we would implement, that she trusted me and so, we were there, we were not there as, we were just there to listen. In fact, we were completely in the background. And, before doing work, you developed relationships. Lucia was playing with their kids. That's the way things happen. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think we could spend a whole hour on that, but this was a stellar presentation. For time's sake, many of us have to get on another Zoom, I fear. Let me just thank Arvind and Alicia for giving us their time and their spirit and sharing with us this morning. It was outstanding. I will get the recording link, and if it's okay with you, I'll PDF your PowerPoints and send those out to the group as well so they can have access to that. Thank you for those of you that are on the phone. The CME code for today was 4FBA2. And join us next month when Reverend David Carl is going to share with us about some of the work that they're doing in terms of his work is being based at Atrium Health in Charlotte. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful, positively deviant day. And we will see you all next month. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Titi, Gary, Francis, Monica, Tom, Emily, Jeffrey, Taylor, Isa, Daniel. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for having us. Yeah, Lucia, it was good we hadn't done things in a while. It was nice to reconnect. For us to connect. Yeah.
Yeah.
Terrific. All right. Bye.